USAID has a formal disinformation program focused on getting advertisers to cut off revenue to misinformation sites and purveyors of misinformation. And I have seen, they have this formally published. In fact, my organization, Foundation for Freedom Online, even published the formal disinformation primer in February 2021, 1 month after Biden took office, where in a 97-page USAID disinformation program memo, 31 times they mentioned the word advertisers as being necessary to kill the revenue to any social media site or any social media account or any independent web page that spreads misinformation. So USAID is contorting the economics of the entire news industry in order to get platforms to censor lest they go economically bankrupt. And remember, this is the major threat to Elon still to this day, but particularly these advertiser boycotts, which crushed the ability. This is why they had to turn to subscriptions and they had to make this $8 a month, $12 a month type thing because of all the ad boycotts. And again, USAID is a formal program to coordinate that in a whole of society fashion. Getting back to Elon's uniqueness. So for a couple of things, as a triple-digit billionaire, he may be more insulated from these kinds of whole of society encirclement economic pressure tactics that someone like Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey had tolerance for. They were only double-digit billionaires, or Zuckerberg. Whereas as a triple-digit billionaire, that actually may be robust enough to resist that. Getting back to this Mark Zuckerberg letter, in 2019, Mark Zuckerberg was making public speeches saying that he thought censorship had gone too far on Facebook. That was 2019.
I remember.
But then he got hit with a very interesting boycott that was called #ChangeTheTerms. And it basically was economically coercing Facebook to change the terms of its terms of service, effectively to ban Trump supporters and Brexit supporters and anyone in Europe who was supporting a right-wing populist party there. And Facebook lost $60 billion in market cap in 48 hours under this boycott. And so Facebook folded like a lawn chair and gave them everything they asked for because $60 billion was enough to break Zuckerberg's back. At the same time, there's
who paid for Change the Terms?
Oh, that's how many hours do you have?
How about 60 seconds? Just bottom line it for us.
I mean, nominally, it was the ADL and color of change under this kind of hate speech idea, but it was joined by dozens of USAID-funded, U.S. State Department-funded NGOs, civil society institutions who were all creating the base of that. So nominally you had these, ADL color of change, and it's about hate speech on social media. But the buffering substructure for it were all these U.S. government intermediaries in country after country. The free and open internet, unfiltered alternative news, the rise of citizen journalists, the rise of citizens in those countries who have larger voices than CIA-backed media, than USAID-funded media, than State Department-funded media, has meant that the State Department has lost control of those countries. And what happened was, after 2016, the technology and the networks were established to be able to add a new toolkit to American diplomacy, which is diplomacy by censorship. And we have formal government programs at the State Department dedicated to getting foreign countries to pass domestic censorship laws to stop the rise of right-wing populist parties in those countries. I'm going to say that again. We have formal government programs at the State Department whose job is to lobby foreign countries and pressure foreign countries to pass censorship laws to stop the rise of domestic populist groups. So you have truckers in America whose income tax is going to pay foreign governments to censor their citizens. This is the sort of schizophrenia right now of American
We're
diplomacy.
becoming the Soviet Union, which exported poison around the world for all those years. I really felt like the United States was, the bulwark against that. But whether that's true or not, I don't know. I'm trying to reassess. What is true now is we're doing what they did. We're sowing chaos and tyranny around the world. It's like I am so heartbroken to see this.
Well, it's amazing you say that because as someone who is sort of present at creation in terms of watching this all get established and spending my whole life monitoring it and chronicling it, they were very aware of that when they were setting this up. And when I say they, I mean NATO, the U.S. State Department, the UK Foreign Office. After the 2016 election and after Brexit, and they began this whole consensus building quest about how to get all the relevant stakeholders from the government, from the private sector, from civil society, and from the media to all come together and create this whole of society censorship coalition, whole of society counter misinformation coalition, technically they call it. But they were very aware of that what they were doing was exactly what they accused Russia and China of doing, intensely aware. They were very careful in establishing it, according to this idea that what we will do is we will be able to essentially have plausible deniability, but even though we're funding it and we're directing it and we are pressuring everyone to join this censorship coalition. And so this is how you had tens of millions of dollars from the U.S. State Department funding the private sector pop-up censorship mercenary firms, funding the civil society institutions, the universities, the censorship activists, the NGOs, the nonprofits, the researchers, and also on the media side, and all these U.S.-funded, USAID-funded media outlets, all pushing for censorship. And there's an elegant structure to it, which is that the government pays the civil society institutions to do essentially CIA work against our own citizens. This is why there's so many CIA analysts at these censorship universities, the censorship labs. They'll call them disinfo labs. At 60 plus U.S. universities, all funded by the U.S. government. They do,
and I assume on cable television too. They're everywhere on all the channels.
Yes. DHS actually, onboards, media organizations into its counter disinformation work. And again, because media is the fourth quadrant in the whole society framework, and it's government, private sector, civil society, and media all aligned like a magnet to create the censorship outcomes so that so there's no holes in the Titanic. No one can resist it. No one can stop it. This is the prop. And it was so effective until Elon Musk essentially burst that bubble, and until they went a little bit too far with the Disinformation Governance Board. And finally, a certain faction within the Republican Party woke up and was able to exert some pressure through the House and Jim Jordan in November 2022. We selectively promote either free speech or censorship depending on what's most advantageous for political control in any particular country. So, for example, if Bolsonaro were to have rose back to power in Brazil, have no doubt about it, free speech would be back on the menu, and Bolsonaro would be accused of censorship, over, jaywalking, on a random street corner, and we would be pumping up through NGOs and university centers and journalists on payroll. We'd be pumping $100 million into Brazil's free speech economy in order to create anti-Bolsonaro sentiment.
That's right.
But, one of the things beginning, and I come back to this Brazil
case.
Can I
just ask you pause one last time? One of the things I've learned from you over the past couple of years, I've learned a lot from you, but one big picture idea that I didn't fully appreciate till I listened to you carefully was that our foreign policy drives our domestic policy.
There's no such thing as domestic policy.
Exactly.
Every country.
I didn't understand. I grew up in a world where there was the foreign policy and like you overthrow Mossadegh or whatever. Maybe that's good for America. You don't even think about it. We're fighting the Soviets. It's not a problem because we are an island of freedom here in the United States. And your reporting and analysis suggests exactly what you just said. There is no domestic policy. Everything that happens in this country is an outgrowth, a function of our management of the world.
Yes. There's no such thing as domestic policy because every country's domestic policy is another country's foreign policy. Whatever you do in the United States or whatever any foreign country, a foreign country wants to change its labor laws. Well, guess what? That impacts the bottom line of U.S. corporations who employ labor pools there. A foreign country wants to nationalize its graphite industry. Well, guess what? Now America can't make pencils. Every internal policy of every other country on earth impacts the bottom line of some U.S. national champion. Now, how the State Department defines national interest is essentially the college of corporations and financial firms that are U.S. national champions. So, for example, if something happens, if Georgia or Azerbaijan does something that impacts the bottom line of ExxonMobil or Chevron or Halliburton, that becomes a State Department priority in order to protect U.S. national interests against this nationalization law that's happening in Georgia or Azerbaijan. And it's the same thing with every industry. And so I do want to get back to this this sort of exporting the First Amendment concept that was such a big part of American statecraft. I think almost no one, there's almost no better example of this than what happened with the State Department's Global Engagement Center, which is the main censorship artery of the U.S. State Department. It also works with a million of these censorship NGOs and USAID and this whole network. It was set up by Rick Stengel. And, Rick Stengel, would you say that his job was to export the First Amendment, former, managing editor of Time Magazine. And it's when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, the guy whose job was to export the First Amendment wrote an op-ed, I believe in the Washington Post, effectively calling for an end to the First Amendment, that it needs to mirror that what Europe and other countries have.
And then he wrote a book making the same case.
Right. But again, this is the guy who was the Undersecretary of Public Affairs. This is
a very evil man, Rick Stengel.
Well, the point that I'm trying to make here is the free speech absolutist who was in charge of U.S. government projection of free speech. All it took was one election for the entire diplomacy architecture that this principle of free speech was based on to get completely bottomed out. All it took was Donald Trump getting elected for, arguably 200 years of a First Amendment principle and 70 years of this principle of exporting the First Amendment to be entirely discarded because it was leading to the wrong kinds of people being elected.